Welcome everyone to the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We had a new playoff iteration come out recently, a 14-team playoff, and it feels like we're going to keep seeing more iterations come out as the time goes on. And then we will get into some comments from the NCAA president, Charlie Baker, about the possible employment status of athletes going forward. Then we'll get into some NFL Combine talk. The defensive linemen and linebackers worked out yesterday, so we'll touch on that to end the show. And we'll continue on with our Combine Watch List series, and we'll do quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers to watch this week. We will miss out on talking about O-linemen and place kickers, but tons of really cool guys to watch there, so definitely be on the lookout for them. I believe their workout day is Saturday and Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and things throughout the show, and the best way for y'all to get your questions read on the show and seen on the show as quickly as possible is to use the link at the bottom of the screen there, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all to see your questions here on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net for any questions that you might have. But let's jump right in because it has been a crazy couple of weeks in college football. The playoff has been taking a lot of the headlines as of recently. It went from a 12-team playoff with a 6+6 format with 6 auto bids and 6 at large to a 12-team with 5+7, 5 at auto bids, 7 at large. And that seems to be what we're working with for 2024 and 2025. But there were question marks after that, right? And it seems like one of the new floated out ideas is a 14-team playoff, which is a weird number to me, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. The 14-team playoff would consist of 3 auto bids from the SEC and Big Ten, which is down 1 from the 4 that they claim that there were rumors that they wanted for the 12 team. So a little bit of a compromise there. You would get 2 for the ACC and the Big 12. You would get 1 for the Group of 5, and then you would have 3 at-large bids unless Notre Dame was in the top 10. Then they would be automatically in, and you would only have 2 at-large bids. Obviously, this creates a lot of questions, which I will get into throughout this. But one of the wrinkles of this is it seems the SEC and the Big Ten are pushing and might be in line to have the 2 buys for their conference champions. And that was one of the big questions following this decision is where does that leave conference championship week? Well, at least in those 2 conferences, it keeps that fight alive to want that first round bye, if you do want that first round bye. But it does, give a little bit more power to the SEC and the Big Ten, and probably is one of the big reasons that they were willing to go down from 4 to 3 auto bids in this new iteration. This is yet another example that the College Football Playoff Committee and the group running it and setting it up is very amenable to whatever, essentially. It seems like they have no problem changing on the fly. They have no problem dealing with, shifts in the landscape of college football. And as we know, that's been happening over the last couple of years, and I expect it to happen again. And I do have that big question of this will go into effect in 2026, which is 2 years away now. We'll have 2 full college football seasons, and we have Florida State and the ACC fighting it out. It looks like Florida State is starting to find their way into finding a way out of that conference, and they're not going to be alone in doing that depending on what the settlement looks like between those 2 parties. But the reality is there are so many teams that will probably end up following Florida State after they make their decision inevitably. So there is this question from my end, and I think from a lot of people's end, where sure, this works for now. When we look at the landscape for now, you want the Big 12, you want the ACC, you want the Group of 5, you want all of them included. But in 2 years, we could have, Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, and Clemson in the SEC, and you could have Virginia and Georgia Tech and all these other teams in the Big Ten. basically you could have an ACC that looks nothing like it does today and wouldn't even be on the same level as the Big 12 is right now. So I I'm very skeptical if this is going to be the model that we go into 2026 with, but this is the newest model that they've floated out there. And for my money, if I, could set it up the way I would like, it would be, first of all, I would go back to having 5 power conferences, make everyone go back to the Pac-12, but that's beside the point. Now that we're down this road, I think I'm really hoping the ACC stays a viable conference. I'm really hoping that Florida State stays in that conference and everyone else can, we can figure out a better media deal or whatever is, holding everything up there, and hope that all of that stays intact. And if that's the case, I really do kind of like this format. I mean, I understand, I don't necessarily love the 14 teams. I think if you're going to do a playoff in a sport that is so spread out and has such a remarkable talent disparity and ability disparity between teams, I think 4, 8, or 16 should be your jumping off points, but they've seemed to enjoy the idea of buys for certain teams. So, while I disagree, this seems to be the newest thing that they're kind of moving forward with, and at the very least, this keeps everyone involved, right? There was a lot of worry that the SEC and the Big Ten were going to kind of monopolize this thing, and I still tend to have my worries about that, but at the very least, this keeps every single conference in the game. It gives a group of 5 team a shot. It gives teams like Notre Dame a shot to get in, although I think this does push Notre Dame even further into possibly joining a conference, but we'll see what happens there. I think it keeps the ACC involved. It keeps the Big 12 involved. It keeps some of what college football is about involved in this process, and I think in the grand scheme of things, that's a great idea, right? You'd love for all of this to go off without a hitch. You'd love for a great, setup. You'd love for everything to work out perfectly. I just tend to think there's going to be so many things changing over the next even 6 months here that will affect this decision making and possibly will affect the 14-team playoff ever happening. And going back to the buys that I was talking about, I've never really understood buys in the college football playoff. It doesn't really much make sense to me. While I get that there are certain teams that might be a little bit above the others, and obviously the Big Ten and SEC champion would be some of the best teams in the country at the end of the year. There's no two ways about that. But the way I look at it is I don't think there's ever going to be a right amount of buys. Whether it's 2 teams or 4 teams or 6 teams, I don't think there's ever going to be a cutoff where the 3rd team that doesn't get a bye, or the 5th team, or the 7th team, whatever team is right on the outside looking in, there will always be arguments for them being over the other 2 or the other 4 or the other 6. So it creates even more trouble for the playoff committee and for this idea in general than there really needs to be. Because if you have a 16-team playoff, let's say, and you have Georgia all the way up at the top, and your number 16 team, more than likely, it'll depend on the season and depend on the team, but more than likely will be the group of 5 team that finds their way in by winning their conference. And that's a game that I'm sure Georgia wouldn't mind playing to open their playoff. It's a nice game to get into things. And also, these kids, we've seen how bye weeks affect college football teams throughout the season. A lot of teams come back from bye weeks and they just look slower. They look a little bit less disciplined, whatever it is. I don't know if they want that to happen in the most important game of the season for them. So I don't think anyone would shy away from having a bye, because it is an absolute grind of a season, and there's definitely some health factors that you'd like to get right. But at the end of the day, I just don't think there's ever going to be a right number of buys where everyone's like, okay, that totally makes sense, let's move forward, and everyone will be hunky-dory at the end of the day. So I tend to believe we should just jump to 16. I think 16 it's the number they do in the FCS. It's a number that makes sense pretty much across the board. You can pretty much include everyone, even in a model where the Big Ten and the SEC have all the power. Even if Florida State and Clemson and Miami and North Carolina and Virginia, all the big ACC brands, if they find other places to play, that's fine. If you have enough teams in this playoff to go around, right? If you have enough room in this playoff to go around. So I think if you set yourself at 16 now, you can adjust with the times without having to adjust that number, which is the biggest problem I've had with this entire process has been we started at 4 and then people started talking about 6, which is what I kind of liked at the time, and then there were talks about 8 and then they jumped straight to 12 and everyone was a little confused, and now it's possibly jumping to 14. And I get that you want to create a, NFL model type playoff with buys and with teams, fighting till the very end to get that last bye. But at the end of the day, the seeding should do enough, right? If you're using a good model and you're using strength of schedule and, different metrics to actually evaluate these teams correctly, the 1 in 16, it shouldn't be a problem that they didn't get a bye, because they should be able to play a team that is the worst of the 16 teams, right? So I think that it opens a lot of different questions, right? Is this going to be the final iteration until 2026? I tend to think no. I think at some point they'll jump up to 16, or at some point it gets a lot sketchier, which I'll get into here in a second. But for the 16-team model, I've always been a proponent of the more teams that you have in, as long as you have some automatic qualifiers. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of auto bids in general, but I understand, wanting to get the group of 5 involved no matter what, wanting to get the ACC and the Big 12 involved no matter what. So that's all well and good. But I think once you get to the at-large bids, I don't see a value in having a committee in a room deciding who's better than the other. I don't really see the value in not having the model that they had, back in the day when maybe some of you weren't really watching college football, but the BCS model, it wasn't perfect because there were only 2 teams at the end of the day. So the margins between those teams were going to be very, very slim. But when you apply it to at-large bids around the country, especially in a model where the SEC and the Big Ten play tougher schedules, they go through more of a grind, they probably play higher level football at the end of the day, there needs to be some type of computer-based algorithm to figure out who actually is the team that deserves, is the best team, whatever you want to call it. There has to be an unbiased, fully unbiased, because I understand that the people in the college football playoff are meant to be unbiased, and for the most part, I think they do a fine job. But at the end of the day, it's hard to keep that out of it, right? So I think it to me, any at-large bid that would be had in a 16-team or a 14-team playoff shouldn't be left up to a group of people, because then you'll probably end up deciding for 3 at-large bids, let's say, in this 14-team playoff, there's probably about 7 teams that would have an argument at the end of the day, and that's just a nightmare to figure out. So I tend to think that the best way to do this is have 16 teams, have some auto bids if you'd like, with the group of 5 and with the ACC and with the Big 12, and then use a BCS model, use a more modern, obviously, but use some type of algorithm to figure out who are the next 3 or 4 or 7 or however many auto or at-large bids. Figure out who those 7 best teams are, because that's what's going to get you the best product at the end of the day. So a lot of different things going on here. I think going back to my idea that this will not be the final iteration to by 2026, I think there's a real reality where we have multiple postseason tournaments going on all at the same time. I talked about Florida State leaving the ACC and the ACC possibly becoming a totally different conference than what we know it to be today, and the Big Ten and the SEC only bolstering their groupings. But at that point, if you are at a point where, say, both conferences have 20 teams and they're among the, top 50 teams in the country for the most part. And I mean, when you look at the athletic departments making the most actually making money off their sports programs, it's almost entirely SEC and Big Ten teams, and the teams that aren't SEC or Big Ten teams are ACC teams that would be one of the first few out the door if this were to pass. So there's tons of things that are going to be moving around this, and I wonder if when they come to the table in 2025, if the SEC is coming off a great year and they've if they're set up to add Florida State and Clemson and Miami and Virginia, just for example, the following year, they have no reason necessarily from their point of view to keep the Big 12 and the ACC involved. And I wish that wasn't the case. I wish they would, have the motivation of just keeping the sport what the sport is. But at the end of the day, you got to look out for your conference. And I think when the Big Ten and the SEC get this new influx of teams, which I think is kind of an inevitability at this point, I think they're going to see the power dynamic become even bigger, their power in that room become even bigger, and then they might just take their playoff and walk away from the rest of the group. They might just have a playoff that works within their conference championship schedule. I heard Josh Pate talking about this earlier this week, where essentially it's an 8-team playoff, but you have 4 teams from the SEC, 4 teams from the Big Ten. It looks a lot like the AFC and NFC, but the game before the championship, so the semifinal of the playoff, technically, would be the SEC and the Big Ten championship. That would keep the energy in the championship weekend, which is something I'm very worried about in the future of this. And then it would also just create a playoff with the best teams in the country, among the best conferences. But then the question is, where does that leave everyone else? And that's obviously a huge worry. That's not something that any college football fan wants, but the Big 12 and the ACC could have the same thing, and then the Group of 5 could have something. It's just the way I see things going is there's going to be such a tiering of college football that becomes so distinct and so clear to pretty much everyone that watches that it's going to be really hard for the SEC and the Big Ten to come to that table and say, yeah, we'll throw them a couple of auto bids. We'll give them, a place in the party without any, without them being on the same level in terms of football ability that we are. I think when you come to the table in 2025, the SEC and the Big Ten are going to have plenty to say. And I think it's going to be more and more demands of why are these other people involved in a playoff if you claim you want the best teams in the playoff. And I wish I could disagree with that argument because it's not what I want to happen. I wish we could flip everything back a couple of years and have honestly, a 6-team playoff. We could go back to the BCS format for all I care. I just want regular season college football to mean as much as it's always meant. I want all of the energy around conference championship week. I want all of the energy around bowl season, but that seems to be gone. And I think we need to try to salvage this as best we can, and hopefully the SEC and the Big Ten understand that the fans want everyone to be part of the same postseason. But I worry that that's not going to be the case. But tons to be answered here, tons still to be talked about. I'm not sure that this will be the last time that we hear a new iteration of the playoff. In fact, I'm sure this will not be the last time, even in the next 6 months, that we hear about a new iteration. But tons to think about, tons to look forward to, I guess. But we're going to take a short break here. And then when we get back, the NCAA president, Charlie Baker, had some very interesting comments about what employment would do to the college football landscape. So we will get into all of that right after this break.